Hi everybody! Today we are going to paint some small birds. This is a follow-up to our previous video on birds, but this time we're focusing on the smaller ones. But before we dive in, let's start with the basics of drawing a bird. All you need to do is make a circle and define the axis. And from there, you basically already have your bird defined. It's really that simple. And it works great for generic birds. But if you want to design something more specific, all you have to do is observe how much of its form fits inside this basic structure. So once again, make a circle, define your axis, and from there the shape of the bird emerges. The smaller the bird, the more of that circle it tends to occupy. If you want to paint a little sparrow, it will almost entirely fill the circle. I've already transferred my sketches to the paper, so now we're ready to paint. So we're going to start with some small generic birds, okay? They are not based on any specific species. They're just small birds. And the reason we're doing this is, once again, to train our ability to convey the idea of a bird, to design and paint birds. So don't worry about anatomy or natural colors or any other natural feature. We're not aiming for realism. We're simply creating birds. I'm using the same technique we used with the larger birds. We start with one flat layer of paint. This first layer is just blocks of flat color. Any sense of volume or texture you see comes from the brushwork. Acrylics and watercolors as well behave organically on the paper, so they naturally create texture. Now for the foliage, I'm using the same technique we've used for almost all our botanical paintings. Start with a very light touch, apply pressure to give the leaf body, and then release the pressure to create a thinner end that touches the stem. Then we create leaves just enough to organically fill the blank spaces, but they don't overlap. By the time we finish that, the bird is ready for the second layer of paint. In the second layer, we add volume. We use more paint to give form to what we did in the first layer. The third layer is where we add shadows and highlights. And that's all you need. You don't have to worry about small details like individual feathers or perfect lines. And the best part of this exercise is that you can use any color you like. This little bird here, we painted yellow and blue, but it could have been any color: red, green, pink, whatever color. So let's repeat the exercise because, as I always say, the more you practice, the easier it becomes. So once again, I paint the first layer of a basic color, filling the entire body of the bird with that particular color. And again, the texture you see is natural. It's all from the paint on the paper and the way we use the brush. All you need to do is follow the natural direction of the feathers with your brush strokes, whether they follow upward, downward, or sideways. While that first layer dries, I go ahead and paint the first layer of foliage. Same technique as before: light pressure, firm pressure, and then light again. This gives you that organic and elegant leaf. You don't have to worry about leaf veins or fine details. Then, once it dries, we apply the second layer to add volume, giving more substance to the colors already there. While that's drying, we can return to the leaves and add some small details, but just light touches, nothing too refined. It's natural and eventually it will become part of your personal painting style. And finally, we apply the third layer to the bird, a soft wash of amber to create shadows and highlights. I'm going to speed up the third painting because we are using exactly the same technique, okay? First layer for color, second layer for volume, and a third layer for highlights and shadows. Once again, the more you practice, the easier it becomes. For each bird, I try different kinds of foliage just to explore the variety and show how flexible this technique is. None of this is based on a specific kind of bird or tree. It's all imaginative. The goal here is to practice forming shapes and becoming comfortable with adding color to them. You will notice that by the time we add the second layer, the bird appears even flatter. But because of how the paint behaves on the paper, it still holds a lovely texture. And something I always say when painting portraits, whether of people or animals, the most important part is the eye. If you paint a good eye, everything else will follow. Now we are going to paint a pair of birds using the same technique. And I'm pretty sure by now you know the sequence. First layer, base color. Second one, volume. Third one, shadows and highlights. This technique works for nearly any medium, from watercolors to oils. The only important thing is that you wait for the paint to dry between each layer. Otherwise, the paint will mix too much and the results will be different from what you want. It's always better to let each layer dry completely before adding the next one. Once the second layer is dry, we add the final highlights, and that's it. Now remember, you don't need to do all three layers. You can stop after the first one, and it will look good. And you can stop after the second, and it's fine too. But if you want a more natural, organic result, just go through all three steps: color, volume, shadows, and highlights. And when I say layer, think of them as steps because sometimes, especially during the volume step, you may need to apply more than just one coat, and that's perfectly okay. Here's another tip for when you're painting birds or any portrait. Make sure your main subject stands out from the background. When I painted this hummingbird, I didn't use green because that would have blended in with the foliage. Instead, I chose a strong orange to ensure the bird remained the focal point. And even though I used a very bright pink on the flowers, you can still see the hummingbird is the highlight. That's the power of color choice. Had I used green or something similar, the bird would have disappeared into the composition. I could and probably should have made the background a little bit paler, but even so, the focal point is still clear. These little leaves are painted by simply touching the tip of the brush to the paper. You can refine them later if you want, but once you get used to the motion, you'll see how easily you can paint flowers and leaves with a single stroke. It really is that simple. Before finishing, I decided to add another coat of paint to the flowers and a third layer to the hummingbird, adding soft shadows that make it look more organic. And once again, this isn't a realistic bird, it's an interpretation. Finally, our last piece of the day is a pair of cockatiels, a special request from one of our community members. I'm using a larger paper, but the process is exactly the same. One layer for basic color, then volume, then shadows and highlights. If you're painting a series of imaginary birds, try using similar colors because they will look better together. And if you're painting birds from nature, try to find a background tone that helps the colors feel at home in the space where you'll display them. One thing to keep in mind, you don't always need to replicate natural colors. For instance, one of the cockatiels is white, but how do you paint white? You don't actually. You simply suggest it with gentle tints and shading. The other bird is gray, but if you just mix black and white to make gray, it will look lifeless. So I added a bit of burnt umber, the same used for the tree trunk here, and a little bit of blue, the same that you see on the base of my palette here. This gives the gray a more vibrant and living tone. Once everything is painted, I just add some final details, but once again, it's all very subtle. This is not about realism, it's an interpretation of the birds. After the first two coats, I focus on the eyes. Again, the most important part. Once the eyes are done, I move on to the final step, adding shadows and highlights. Now, you'll notice I painted everything on white paper. And that's perfectly fine. But personally, I find that leaving the background white can feel a bit stark or disconnected. And that's why I often like to finish with a soft wash over the entire piece. So once everything is dry, I add a very light wash of yellow ochre and burnt amber across the entire painting, including the birds and foliage. This adds warmth and unify the composition. I used a sponge, gently touching the paper without pressing too hard. Pressing would damage the paper and the painting, and we don't want that. And I did the same thing to all paintings we made today. Look at how much warmer and more cohesive the artwork feels after this step. And that's it. These are the results of what we painted today. I hope you learned something new and that this inspires you to paint your own small birds. As always, keep on practicing and thank you for joining us.